Okay, this is going to be a year of a lot of information, a lot of media, a lot of back and forth. A lot of it is going to be pointed, a lot of it, and all of it, or most of it, is going to be designed to somehow or other help you form an opinion generally in the direction of the person who's providing the information wants you to believe. Today's talk is on how to find truth in this untruthful world. And there's a lot of rumor, talk, media, fake news, real news going on all the time. How do you sort through that? And using the internet, which has become the main source of news for so many people, how do you use that tool in order to decipher your way through all this opinion masquerading as news, and news which is very, very directed? Paul Levinson, PhD, is professor of Communications and Media Studies at Fordham University in New York City. He's a nonfiction writer. He's written The Soft Edge, Digital McLuhan, Real Space, McLuhan in the Age of Social Media, and Fake News in Real Context, which have been translated in 15 languages. He's also a science fiction author, including the novels The Silk Code, winner of the Lotus Award for Best Science Fiction Novel of 1999, Borrowed Tides, and The Plot to Save Socrates. He's a frequent contributor on CBS News, CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, the Discovery Channel, National Geographic, the History Channel, and on NPR. And he's also a musician. His 1972 album, Twice Upon a Rhyme, was reissued in 2011, and he has a new album recently released, Welcome Up, Songs of Space and Time, released by Old Bear Records. So without any further ado, let me introduce you to Paul Levinson.
Thank you. Well, I always say, Steve gives me such great introductions. I hate to interrupt him and start talking to you myself. But let me start this out by mentioning a few years ago, I was foreperson of a jury in White Plains, New York. Okay, is that better? Foreperson on a jury right here in White Plains, New York. And actually, like most other people, I didn't even particularly want to be on a jury. I was hoping somehow, they would not include me. And I certainly didn't want to be foreperson. But what did me in was the defense attorney during the voir dire, that is, you ask the potential jurors questions, said to me, could you believe that a police officer would ever lie? And I just sort of blurted out, are you kidding? There's not a human being on the face of this earth who doesn't lie. And, that I think is what got me on the jury, because but fortunately or unfortunately, there's a lot of truth in that. And I've even thought about this from a biological point of view. Let's face it, our goldfish, our cactus, even our beloved dog, they don't lie, right? When a dog whines, it's because it's unhappy about something. It's not trying to sucker us into doing something. It doesn't feel good. That's why it's whining. But we human beings whine all the time just because we want to get some advantage from some situation. It's not because we really feel bad. It's a strategy. And so I came to the conclusion a long time ago that one of the things that makes us human, and you know, over the millennia, Aristotle said what makes us human is our rationality. An anthropologist by the name of Alexander Marshak said what makes us human is we tell stories. And I always liked Marshak's point of view on that, because I would say one of the things that makes us human is our capacity to lie, which we call upon very frequently. And it gets even more complicated because, as you know, we all know, and you know, if you've ever studied ethics in a philosophy class, there are all kinds of lies. And you know, we could even make a distinction between lies of commission, that is, when you tell something that's false, and lies of omission, when someone asks you to tell them what's going on or about anything, and you don't tell them the whole story. And this gets exacerbated in our media. For example, most people correctly think that there's a difference between documentaries and docudramas, right? A docudrama is a story that is taken from history, so in that sense it's not fictional, but the people who are portraying these people in history are not the people themselves in history. They are actors and actresses. So, you know, a really famous example, I actually did see this film a long time ago, one of the many films about Abraham Lincoln. Henry Fonda played the role. It's a very good movie. Now, Henry Fonda had a great basso profundo speaking voice 77 years ago. You know, he really knew how to speak. It turns out that historians tell us that Abraham Lincoln did not have a very good speaking voice. He had a high-pitched, squeaky speaking voice. But Hollywood thought, hey, you know, we want, you know, Americans, this was in the 1940s, to hear the spirit of Lincoln. Didn't matter that Lincoln himself didn't speak very well. So we get that docudramas are not completely accurate. But we don't often think about the ways in which documentaries also are not completely accurate. They are accurate in the sense that if they're honest, they are showing us real people talking. Clips of real people in interviews, clips of real people maybe in the news media. So that part is honest and real. But what documentaries don't often, if ever, emphasize are all the things they leave out of the story. And in a way, and I think a very significant way, the documentary is the template for journalism and news reporting. Because when you read an article in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or the Daily News, there is always a lot that's not included in the article. No news report can just be a completely comprehensive, beginning to end report of every single thing that happened in a news story. If that were the case, it would make even the daily New York Times, let alone the Sunday New York Times, too big for anyone to carry or read in any reasonable period of time. So reporters make decisions, and their editors make decisions. Now, at least newspapers, they can be as big or as short as needed. right? You just add a few more pages if you have more stories to report. When you get to radio and television, then in addition to reporters and editors in newspapers leaving things out, you have very strict time limitations. Now, obviously, if it's some kind of earth-shaking event, then the limitations are pushed aside, and then the radio and television reports take as long as they need to tell you the story. But that's really fairly rare. Most of the time, it's a half an hour. Even the all-news cable stations, each show is an hour long. They have a certain number of stories that they're covering. They have a certain number of conversations that they might be having with guests online. And if there's more information that you need to find out, maybe they'll say, well, take a look at our webpage. You'll find more information there. But that's not the same as giving you the more information right then and there in that newscast. So I could talk all day just about that kind of subtle but ubiquitous lack of truth in every news report that we receive, from the most honorable media, from reporters with the highest degree of integrity. So that kind of lie, a lie of omission, is actually intrinsic to the very nature of news reporting. But in addition to that, as we all know, there is also a lot of deliberate lying, misrepresentation. It comes in all shapes and forms. And it didn't begin in the 21st century. Abraham Lincoln, once again, is a great example, not just of what Henry Fonda did in the docudrama about Lincoln, but you can easily find online a photograph of Abraham Lincoln taken in the 1860s. He looks pretty good, you know. He's standing there, very good posture. Lincoln's face. A lot of people don't know, and these were the very early days of photography. So it was a pretty amazing effort, but they were able to do this back in the 1860s. It turns out that in that photograph, the head from the neck up, that's Lincoln. The rest is John Calhoun, which is especially ironic because you may recall in history, Calhoun was a Southern senator that Lincoln just, on every single issue vehemently disagreed with. Calhoun, great defender of slavery. Calhoun, more than happy to lead the Confederacy into secession. And you might ask, so why is Lincoln's head on Calhoun's body? The answer is, in addition to not having the greatest speaking voice, Lincoln didn't have the greatest posture. He tended to slouch. He was a great president, a great thinker. He had great ideas. But by and large, he was not that comfortable in public. He was very shy in many ways. And so the poor White House photographers in the 1860s took a lot of photographs of Lincoln, and he just didn't look that good. And then somebody said, well, hey, maybe we can get Lincoln to look more like John Calhoun. And then they said, well, wait a second, we don't have to get him to look more like John Calhoun. We can take this photograph of John Calhoun, what we would today say is Photoshop John Calhoun's head out of the photograph, Photoshop Lincoln's head back into the photograph, and voila, we have a president with great posture. And by the way, photography shortly after that, for some reason Lincoln was like a favorite subject of these photographic tricks. There's also a very famous photograph of Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's wife and then widow, a few years after Lincoln was assassinated. And it's a very poignant, sad photo. She's sitting at a desk, sort of looking wistfully, and right in back of her is a sort of blurry apparition of good old Abe. Abe came back. He knew that there was going to be a photograph taken of his beloved wife, although I don't know how beloved she actually was, but that's another story in history. But Abe came back. He did the right thing for this photograph. And so there you can see Mary Todd Lincoln sort of looking up, and right in back of her is Abe, So obviously, that also was a kind of trick photography. So those lies, because they are lies, it's an unpleasant word, but it was a deliberate false concoction. Those were not lies of omission, they were lies of commission. And as we know, it happens with increasing frequency as our media get more and more sophisticated. Now, I haven't yet talked about how we can find truth in this world chock full of falsity. Don't worry, I'll get to that sooner or later. But I could also spend all day and all week, in fact, just talking about and giving you examples of deliberate falsities in the news media, what are called fake news. But I can sort of skip ahead. I mean, you're familiar with most of them. Skip ahead to something which actually is relatively new on the scene, something called deep fakes. Have any of you heard of deep fakes? Okay, good. I'm glad word is getting out. Because this goes beyond photography. This goes into motion photography and videos. And if you think about it, what makes the photograph such a powerful disseminator of fake news is that it looks real. I mean, just think about this for a second. If you look at a painting, regardless of how realistic and talented the painter is, and therefore the painting is, you know in your head that an artist, sat down, was looking at something, but what you see on the canvas comes from the artist's brain. Now, it's true that when you point a camera at something, or nowadays point a phone at something, you are making a decision about where to point it, what kind of depth should be in the photograph, how wide the frame should be. All of that is true. But it's also true that the essence of the photograph is the light bouncing off the object that's being photographed. For most of its history, bouncing off that object and then making a registration on a photochemical plate or piece of film. It's different with digital, but it's still the same origin. So that's why when we look at a photograph, we tend to believe it. Even our language for describing photography gets at this difference. We take a photograph. We don't take a painting unless we're taking somebody else's painting that already exists. We paint a painting. See, it's the human process. Maybe we make a painting, maybe we do a painting, but that very language, that very phrasing points at the fact that it is a human being who is bringing that painting into being. That's the essence of the painting, the human action. In contrast to the photograph where the action is out there. We just take a photograph. And that's why we tend to believe it, more than a written description. You know, if you listen to someone describing something, or you read a description of something, again, we're all pretty smart. We know when we're reading it that this is not a first-hand experience. We're not literally seeing or hearing what the person is writing or talking about. So, for example, I just told you about Lincoln. And that's not as convincing as it would have been if I'd actually put the photograph of Lincoln on John C. Calhoun's body right next to the original John C. Calhoun photograph, which I could have done and shown to you here, but I'll tell you the truth, I didn't have enough time. I mean, I could have done that, but there's so many things I wanted to tell you about that I didn't want to be slowed down by showing you those pictures, especially when they're so easily discoverable online. And I have that picture in my book, Fake News in Real Context, if you really want to see it. But my point is, when someone describes something to you, we know inherently that that's a second-hand representation. We're not directly experiencing that. But when we see a photograph, we feel like we are directly experiencing that image. Because, again, the photograph is, at its essence, light bouncing off an object. When we move from photography to video, then it gets even more convincing and therefore more seductive. Because one thing a photograph doesn't have is motion, and it doesn't have sound. Fortunately, that picture of Abraham Lincoln's head on John Calhoun's body doesn't have Lincoln talking in his high-pitched, squeaky voice, because that would have undermined what the picture was trying to do. But a video has all of those things. A video has that photographic power, this direct reflection of reality. It has motion, and it has someone talking. It has sound. So what is a deep fake? There has been the capacity through sophisticated and now even not so sophisticated video technology, meaning it's not that hard for most people to even do this, to right now create a video of Barack Obama saying, "This election is so important. I just have to tell you that I am endorsing Bernie Sanders for president." Now, if we know our politics, we would know that there'd be something fishy about that video. I don't know really who would believe it, but then again, people believe all kinds of things. But it's important to keep in mind that these deep fake videos can convince people. There's, by the way, Barack Obama calling right now, assuring us that no, he doesn't support Bernie. But the point is, we've now moved from a stage in which not only can a still photograph be manipulated, but a video with people talking and people moving can be manipulated so it looks like we are seeing these real people say things which in fact they did not say. So far as I know, in the 2020 campaigns, I'm not sure, I mean, for all I know, they have been released, but I haven't seen any major fake videos like that disseminated. But I think probably sooner or later they will. So this brings me to, again, I could keep talking about these unhappy situations because they're legion, but I wouldn't be talking about them if I thought it was a hopeless case. And in fact, quite to the contrary, I think that we now, in the year 2020, in the age of fake news, in the age of easy photoshopped, manipulated images, in the impending age of deep fake videos, we have the capacity to identify those and measure them up against the truth in a way that we have never before had in our history. And that way is through the same internet that is also the prime carrier of all of these distortions and all of this fake news. In other words, unlike many of my colleagues in the academic world, I don't decry the internet. I don't say, oh my God, can't we go back to the good old days? I mean, it's a question of how far back you want to go, where I just get my news from a newspaper, or okay, newspapers and radio, or all right, newspapers and radio and television, Walter Cronkite. Can I just do that? Well, actually, you can if you want to. But the point is, this same internet that makes it so easy to disseminate fake news also makes it possible to identify news as fake. And how do we do that? Well, to begin with, let's go back again to philosophy, which I think is a good basis for understanding these issues. Over the millennia, there have been a few philosophers here and there who've denied that truth even exists. They thought it's very clever to say, hey, you know what? There is no such thing as truth. That basically, you have one opinion, I have another opinion. There is no truth. It's just differences of opinion. For those of you who may have taken philosophy courses, back in your university days, you've heard even the term for this, relativism. Extreme relativism. There is no such thing as truth. Now, the truth about that, we want to say that everything is equal and there's no such thing as truth. Then that's pretty much the end of our conversation, because there's really no way that you can prove to someone who doesn't want to accept logic and evidence that truth exists. And so, in terms of philosophy, the belief in truth is an assumption, which we don't have to make if we don't want to. For that matter, the fact that we think logic and evidence can bring us to the truth, that's also based on the assumption that logic and evidence work. If, for example, you asked me, how could I convince you that logic is the best way of understanding things? There's no way I could convince you other than appealing to your logic. But that basically assumes that logic is an accurate way of getting at the truth. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. That nihilistic argument, which is irrefutable if you don't want to accept that truth exists, and you don't accept logic as a way of demonstrating that truth exists. But and I think most people, believe that there is such a thing as truth. We also believe we may not be in possession of all of it. We also recognize that there are things like optical illusions, right? We're driving on a highway on a hot summer day and we see far in front of us like a shimmering pool of water. But when we get closer to that water, it turns out there's no water there. It was an optical illusion. The light bouncing off the highway hits our eyes at a certain angle, and it looks like there is water out there. So our senses can indeed be mistaken. But most of us, I would say really just about all of us, unless we're Friedrich Nietzsche or someone like him, believe that there is such a thing as truth. And that what we think, what we believe, can be measured against that truth. And again, if we don't accept that there is such a thing as truth, then that's pretty much the end of the discussion, because by denying there's truth, there's no even point in talking about falsity, because everything is just, the same. But if we accept the fact that there is such a thing as truth, then right there we have the beginning of a path for identifying whether something is true or not, whether something is false or not. If so, how false? Because if there is a news report, if there is a video that we see, all that we need to do is search out the truth of that situation and see if the report and the video or the photograph correspond to the truth, and if not, how much they diverge from the truth. So, just to give a very current, and I hope no more tragic example than it currently is, you've all heard about the coronavirus. And I suppose there are some conspiracy theorists who might think that there is no coronavirus, that's just one big conspiracy theory. Again, there's not much you can do if a person wants to argue that every single report about someone sick or dying from this virus was made up. You really can't discuss this any further. Okay, that you want to assume that? Okay. But if you don't assume that, then the question is, how do we know that this report is accurate, that report is accurate, and so forth, in a very dangerous and fast-changing situation? Well, I mean, you could do it the old-fashioned way. You could ask your doctor, you're going in for some kind of general, yearly checkup. Hey, doc, what's going on with this coronavirus? Should I be worried about it here in White Plains? And your doctor is a valuable source of information. Your doctor, she or he, will almost definitely tell you the truth as he or she knows it. But even that's just one person. So here, I think, is a better way. If you see a report about something, if you see a report that, God forbid, someone passed away, someone, a great musician, someone like Kobe Bryant in a plane crash or a helicopter crash, anything like that. How can you ascertain whether that is true or not? And the answer is easier than it's ever been before. The way of doing that is to look online in as many different places as you can to see what all of these other sources are saying about that very same event. And although it's certainly possible that a given news operation might be mistaken, and it's not only possible, but in the very, very early phases of news reporting about any big news event, there's going to be misreporting. So, for example, getting back to the political situation, we did not know in Iowa what was going on. And it even took a long time in Nevada to find out the results of that caucusing. And there were other reports about who was leading based on various interviews of people who were at the various caucuses and so on. But ultimately, the only way that we can ascertain what really happened and ascertain it with confidence is by checking more than one source. Now, before the internet, it was still possible to check more than one source. If you go back to, again, the age of just newspapers, here in the New York City area, there were probably as many as a dozen newspapers in the heyday of newspapers. So although one newspaper might have gotten something wrong, back then it would have been highly unlikely that a dozen newspapers would all have gotten that story wrong. And today, we have far more than a dozen sources. And by the way, I'm not even talking just about traditional sources that are available online, like all the major newspapers, all the major television news networks and cable networks. I'm talking just about human beings, sometimes who are eyewitnesses to these events. And again, any one of them, or even more than one, could have been mistaken or lying. But for the first time in our history, we have the capacity in a matter of minutes to check 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 sources, different sources. Now, that doesn't give us 100% assurance. Nothing can possibly do that. It could be that somehow all of the different sources, even though they're different companies, even though we're talking about Fox on the one hand and MSNBC on the other, you can't get much different than the two of them. They both could have somehow gotten some mistaken information. But I think it's still much better that we now have this ability through the internet, through the web, to get in touch with as many different sources as possible. In addition to that, we have through the internet an interactive capacity. There are places where we can actually ask people questions. In addition to that, we have something which I think I talked about this the last time I was here, citizen journalism, which shouldn't be relied upon exclusively, but it provides yet another way of people being able to get information from people who are on the ground, who can get that information right out there. So I want to leave time for questions, so I'll end this now, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. With this maybe surprising point, but I think it's true. I don't think this is fake news, but I'm now going to tell you. I think that the payoff in this, our age of fake news, in which the possibilities of fake news are rampant and more than ever before in history, the very same internet engines that have gotten us so enmeshed in fake news, those very same digital engines provide a great way of shedding ourselves of fake news by identifying things as fake news. And we'll see whether that's true or not. So far, in the campaign for the 2020 presidency, I don't know of any major fake news story that has had any impact on the campaign. And I predict that if some deep fakes come out there and if they fool some people, it'll be a relatively short deception because of these other capabilities via the internet to identify fake news. So the era of fake news, ironically, might be the beginning of a golden age of citizens learning how to identify the truth as never before in human history. And if that's the case, then we might be in for some good times ahead. If it's not the case, well, then I'll offer the future my apologies for being wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Just for the record, you seem to be a little more optimistic than I am on that point. Any questions from the audience?
If you have a question, stand up.
Please stand up and please give it to the mic so everyone can hear it.
The conspiracy people, amazingly, I mean, there are still people who don't believe we ever went to the moon.
Right.
And all the sources that we can find all show that we were on the moon, but these people still think it's fake.
Right. Yeah, well, this is why lies are so popular in the first place, and it gets back to what I said at the very beginning, which is we human beings have a propensity for lying and trafficking in lies. And to get back to the political situation, I know some people who, to this very day, believe that in the 2016 campaign, that actually Bernie got more popular votes in the Democratic primary than did Hillary Clinton, and somehow the Democratic establishment, fixed the vote count so it seemed that Hillary Clinton got more votes. So, this has been demonstrated many, many times. It didn't happen. But if you are a person and you have no connection to any of the apparatus of the Democratic National Committee and the Democratic Party and how the votes were tallied and counted, and you tend to have a grievance that why didn't Bernie get the nomination in 2016, you have a propensity to believe that. It's just as false as that claiming that we didn't get to the moon, it was all faked. But again, what the internet does is it gives us a way, whether we're talking about the moon or we're talking about Bernie Sanders, to with very little effort, really, further investigate these claims and see what everyone else is saying. And again, unless you want to, be a conspiracy theorist to the point where you think every single source on the internet is lying. Fox News is lying, MSNBC is lying, the New York Times is lying, the Wall Street Journal is lying. Every single element is lying. You can't refute that if somebody wants to believe it, but that's what it takes to, continue the conspiracy theory.
Right. In this age of what I call spin doctors, if you could imagine yourself in the White House press room, listening to the press secretary of the president giving their version of the news, how does a reporter do their job and try to decipher through BS?
Yeah. Well, you notice that there have been very few press conferences. But the answer to that is you just have to keep asking the tough questions. And I think I mentioned the last time I talked here, fake news really sort of, again, it's been around for a long time, but when it really broke into the public arena in a big way was at a press conference in New York City in January 2017, after Trump had been elected president and before, however, the inauguration. So he was president-elect, and he was standing at a podium much like this. No, it was a little fancier than this. But he was standing at a podium, and Jim Acosta from CNN raised his hand with a question. And Trump looked at him and said, "You're Jim Acosta. You're with CNN. You're fake news. CNN is fake news. I'm not going to call on you." And in a systematic way, Donald Trump, but he's not the only one, but since we're talking about that event in January 2017, that was the beginning of a systematic attempt to undermine the legitimate press, who indeed had questions to ask, as illegitimate as purveyors of fake news. And that is a very good way of being able to tell your story regardless of what reporters want. Let me just give you one interesting historical analogy, and I'll get to the next question. Donald Trump is a master of Twitter. Whatever we might think of him, he has an incredibly acute gut instinct for tweeting and communicating to his base and the world in that way. And the reason why he loves Twitter is because there's no reporter to ask him questions. He can tweet whatever he wants. And I'm not saying that Donald Trump is an Adolf Hitler in terms of what Hitler did. But I will say that Hitler and his minister of propaganda and popular enlightenment, Joseph Goebbels, who, by the way, got his Ph.D. at the University of Heidelberg in 1922, so a Ph.D. is no indication that you're a good person. Hitler basically also hated the press. He called them the Lügenpresse, the lying press, and Hitler and Goebbels loved radio. Why? Because through radio you could communicate directly to the German people in the 1930s. You didn't have to worry about the press, in Hitler's view, misrepresenting his views. So you wouldn't have had Hitler without radio. Marshall McLuhan made that point. I've made the point, but I'm not the only one who's made that point. You wouldn't have Donald Trump without Twitter. And that's one of the ways in which he circumvents dealing with the press.
What's the difference between a lie and an exaggeration?
Well, that's a very good question. An exaggeration implies that there's some truth in that, right? What are you exaggerating? In other words, something happened. So, like, you go out with somebody and you have a good time, and your friend says to you, so hey, so how did it go last night? And you say, oh, she was crazy about me, she's already fallen in love with me. So there's truth in that you did go out with someone the night before, and there's probably truth that you did have a good time, but you're exaggerating it. You're making it seem that the evening was much, much better, and maybe it ended much, much better than it actually ended. A lie could be that, but also a lie can be a complete exaggeration, something that just didn't happen at all. But let me say one other thing about that. I'm glad you asked that point, because Trump's denunciation of media as fake news, I would not defend the media by saying they never say anything wrong. They never make mistakes. They never even deliberately don't do things. For example, I saw on MSNBC a couple of weeks ago, before Bloomberg was in the race, they were showing like the top Democrats, and they just showed 5 Democrats. They didn't show Elizabeth Warren. So what's that? Not that I'm such an Elizabeth Warren supporter, I'm not particularly, but when MSNBC was asked about that, they said, well, there wasn't room for her image. Anyone who knows anything about television, you have room for 5 images, you have room for 6 images. So there you have, clearly the media not being thoroughly honest for whatever reason. So when you say the media are fake news, it's ultimately an exaggeration, not just an outright lie, because the media do things that are wrong.
The problem that I see is not necessarily that people can find this information to verify truth or false. The problem is that people have to want to look for it. If Lindsey Graham says something, or if Trump says something, there's a segment of the people that are going to say, okay, that's it. I don't need to look any further. They said it. How do we get people to be motivated to look and actually go ahead and do what you have suggested, which is the logical thing to do?
That's a great question, and the only answer I can think of is to constantly tell people that they should not trust anything that they see in one place for the first time. And yeah, there are going to be some people who, no matter what you say, no matter how cogently you lay out the logic of that argument, they're still going to believe the first thing they say, or to some extent even worse, they'll believe anything that supports what their point of view is. That's human nature as well. I want all of you in this audience to think, oh my God, this Levinson, what great ideas. I agree with every single word that he said. I know that's not the case, but that's what I would like. We want people to agree with us, and so we tend to seek out and bask in views that support what we already know. But nonetheless, it's not an either-or thing. In that group of people who want reinforcement of their opinions, there are fringes who are not 100% sure, and that's where we can start.